While Walter Hill hadn't been keen on concept art, he had been putting in the miles when it came to performers for Alien, and left Ridley Scott with a strong list of contenders. Meryl Streep, who just starred in Fox's Julia, had been at the top of the list, but she'd just lost a loved one and it didn't seem that it would work out. One of the classmates of hers at Yale Drama School, though, Sigourney Weaver, was considered a possibility, but so was Christina Rains. Scott had worked with her on Duelists and had versatile film experience, while Weaver had never done a film before. What helped improve their chances was the revised script. When the prior script was being used, no one was interested. Candice Bergen and Jane Fonda both turned the film down. Tommy Lee Jones was a rising star, transitioning from daytime soaps to films. He seemed a good choice for Dallas. He came back saying the only interesting character in the whole film was the monster. If he could play the monster, he was in. But after the revised script, everything changed. Tom Skerritt, whose role in MASH helped catapult him to prominence, liked it immensely. But he was turned off when he learned the original meager budget was only $2 million and assumed he'd be stuck working with an Ed Wood type. But that changed when Ridley Scott was signed on. Skerritt was impressed with Scott as a creative and had actually seen The Duelists, so he figured Scott would find a way to make this work. He'd take the role of Captain Dallas, which would also help with the fear factor, as he would be the recognizable film star in the picture. The audience would subconsciously presume that he's the hero. Seeing the monster take out the hero would sell just how screwed the Nostromo crew was. Yaphet Kotto was enthusiastic about the project, describing it as one of the best scripts he'd ever read. He had such faith in it that he turned down roles to ensure that there wouldn't be any chance he'd miss out on this film. While Skerritt noted that this wasn't an actor's picture, it was a picture that could help an actor's career. The cast would be memorable for their everyday working stiffs coming face to face with inhuman terror. While Kotto had played the villain in the James Bond film Live and Let Die and had a role in Richard Pryor's Blue Collar, Alien could really be good for him if it took off, especially the way that Star Wars was taking off. After all, Parker would be the second to last to die, and in an act of very human, if ultimately futile, heroism. He told Dan O'Bannon that this was a role he'd waited 15 years for, and he knew it was going to be a big film. Veronica Cartwright was a child actor, most famous for her role in Hitchcock's The Birds, trying to keep her career going as an adult. She wound up moving back to Britain. She'd been born there but came to America during her acting career, and eventually wound up in the remake of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Unlike the others, she wasn't impressed with the script, but since they were casting in England anyway, she went. She spoke to Scott for hours while he shared Giger's artwork and talked about the film, and it all crystallized. She reread the script with a new perspective and saw what it was like, and finding out that Skerritt and Kotto were already on board, that sold her. These were actors who wouldn't take a cheap exploitation film role. Since Cartwright was British, she also conveniently contributed towards the Edie Levy quota. This naturally was what made Ian Holm an attractive choice for the studio. Far more known for the theater, Holm was told that it was an expensive B-movie, a contradiction in terms, but it didn't matter. He wasn't snobbish about doing high-concept work. He was just wondering what playing the robot Ash would require of him. Scott was clear he was picturing a robot made to fit in with humans, so Holm wasn't going to need to worry about trying to develop tics and mannerisms that would convey his mechanical nature, though he would come up with a few during the film. They even considered whether Ash might not be aware he's a robot, that he was duped into thinking he was human to make him more convincing. But ultimately they decided against that, and probably for the best. A scientist is likely to find out they're not human sooner or later, and that's not really the story this film was trying to tell. Ash was the embodiment of the corporate inhumanity, not a philosophical exploration of artificial intelligence. For the role of Brett, veteran character actor Harry Dean Stanton was considered, but he wasn't too sure about it. He spoke personally with Ridley Scott. I told him I didn't like science fiction. He said he didn't either, but he liked this one. Stanton was a working actor, though, with more than 200 screen roles over his career, the longest being an 8-episode recurring role on Gunsmoke. Stanton had done everything from westerns to sitcoms, from The Godfather Part 2 to The Green Mile to Escape from New York. A hard-working actor bringing to life a working stiff in space was a fine choice. He worked alongside Kodo to develop a bit of a rapport that would come through in their performances. Every film I do, I try to use the other actor. I try to get to know them as soon as I can, and I try to react to them as close as possible to what my reactions would be off camera. I try for believability and a total reality before the camera, as much as I can bring. For the role of Kane, Scott knew exactly who he wanted in the role, John Hurt. Famous as the Elephant Man and in Midnight Express, Hurt was a great choice to bring depth to the small but vital role of Kane. There was only one problem. He was committed to Zulu Dawn, which was being filmed on location in South Africa. John Finch, who had impressed Scott in Roman Polanski's Macbeth, was given the role instead. Finch went through all the setup. He would need to have a monster burst from his chest after all, so there was lots of prep work that was going to be needed for him. Only, as the first day of the shoot got closer, he started looking really bad. On the very first day, he collapsed and was rushed to the hospital. Accounts disagree on whether or not he managed to make it to a second day, but it was very clear that he couldn't do the film. Turns out he had pneumonia. Well, Ridley Scott went looking for someone to play Kane, only to learn that by a stroke of absurd fortune, John Hurt was available after all. Why? It's complicated. While South Africa was under apartheid, they were vigorous in watching for any foreigner who was deemed quote-unquote hostile to them, and they kept a list. These people were typically blacklisted from entering the country. Well, an American by the name of John Hurd was arrested during an anti-apartheid march. The South African authorities put him on the blacklist as a result. Now, I haven't been able to find primary sources backing this anecdote up, so one of two things happened. Either this was John Hurd, the actor who would go on to be in Home Alone and The Sopranos, or the South African authorities confused someone named John Hurd with the actor John Hurd. It's not an uncommon name, especially with different spellings, as an American ambassador to the country was actually named John Hurd, H-U-R-D. Either way, South Africa's security organization, BOSS, B-O-S-S, noted that John Hurd, actor, was barred from entering South Africa. So when John Hurt, actor, wanted a visa so he could shoot a movie there, it was rejected. There's something darkly humorous that a foreigner being forbidden to enter a country was asked to be in a film called Alien. With John Hurt now free, Scott called him up and asked him to get a drink and discuss the role. He gave Hurt the complete pitch, and that was all it took. Hurt would get picked up at 7 the next morning to start on the film. No prep work, just their conversation. They reshot the material on the bridge that had been done with Finch, and Hurt immediately got the hang of what was needed for the role. He was ready to have something explode out of him when the time came. That brings us to The Survivor, which gets a little complicated. Cartwright had read for the role of Ripley, but Scott wasn't 100% on board with it being her. More scouting was going to be underway before anything got locked down with the most important character. Well, since her first consideration, Sigourney Weaver now had a film under her belt, the Israeli picture Madman. Hardly a critical success, but her role in it was enough to convince Hill that she would be a great choice. Through a mix-up, she was sent to the wrong place and arrived half an hour late to meet with him about her possibly being in the film. And then, when asked about the script, commented that it was bleak and that the characters don't relate to each other at all. Part of it was believing that letting the director know where you stood would help make for a better decision and role. But another part was believing she had shots at far better roles than this. Well, what made Scott and the heads of Brandywine so impressed was her physicality. It wasn't just that she was tall, nearly 6 feet, but it was a poise and movement that was described as aristocratic, a presence that they thought would come through in the film. She flew out to speak to Alan Ladd, dressed shabbily because her luggage was lost. No way to know how much it affected Ladd's view, but he wasn't completely sold on Weaver. A screen test was arranged, making up a hallway to look like a spaceship corridor. She arrived and was surprised. She looked at the aesthetic and was even more surprised. She'd had a preconception of science fiction, and this was not it. Something beautiful and terrible at the same time. It seemed like some mental crevasse had been crossed because she returned to Ripley and suddenly wanted to play this person. A part originally written for a man but revised for a woman, letting her keep all these aspects that traditionally were considered too masculine for a woman to play. Ripley started to remind Weaver of a friend who had also been something of a mentor figure, and her character arc came into focus. When the time came, she was down for it, and Scott tried to make it look cinematic even for the screen test, complete with smoke and everything. Ray Hassett, who would go on to play one of the rebel officers in The Empire Strikes Back, was hired to play Dallas for the day, and he and Weaver, topless, acted out the sex scene in what followed. Ladd saw the screen test, then brought in all the secretaries in the building to watch it to get their views on Weaver. They all compared her favorably to other name actresses, and Ladd agreed that she was the one for the role, which was good because there was mounting pressure. The Empire Strikes Back was slated for 1980, so they needed a big picture for the 1979 summer season, and they were banking on Alien filling that role. It wasn't helped by the confusion of which woman was their survivor. Cartwright, who had been told twice she was playing Ripley, was never told that it was still being considered. Pre-production was confused, and Weaver was unhappy when told to come in and get fitted for the role of Lambert. Originally, she'd actually been attracted to that role, finding that Lambert got lots of good lines. But now she had been immersed in Ripley's mind and soul, and called her agent demanding to know if Ripley had been taken away from her. She was assured Ripley was hers, while Cartwright was outraged. She didn't see good lines. She saw someone crying and losing it. They explained to Cartwright that it was actually important. She would be the audience in here, the one who reacts to all of this the way the average person would, which is dread, fear, and finally terror. So she accepted the role of Lambert. And then, of course, there was the title character. Peter Mayhew, who played Chewbacca, was considered, along with tall women, for grace, and basketball players, for sheer height. It was a friend of Powell's who told them to come down to the London Soho pub to meet someone. In walked Nigerian graphic arts student Balaji Badejo, 6'10" and had to bend to get through the door. He was also thin and had experience moving with grace. He could only have been more ideal if he'd been a trained actor. Still, he thought being in a movie sounded interesting, and now they had their alien. Alien was a bit of a different shoot thanks to the demands from its performers. 7 actors that all had experience but from both sides of the pond. There were no minor parts and no major stars. It was a confined ensemble. So what emerged was a bit of a culture clash with acting. The British are, of course, famous for their pedigree of great actors. The British approach is mastery of craft, voice, movement, control. As I've said before, the Picard speech is giving writers far too much credit when it is Patrick Stewart's mastery of craft, examining the text and finding the subtleties behind the words, bringing out the poetry. That's what really matters. Vital when the most famous and respected plays are in a style of speaking half a millennium out of date. When I was preparing to rehearse Macbeth 4 years ago, I ran into Sir Ian on the streets. He's been a friend for many years. And soon after that, we were to go into production together, and he said to me, "Can I mention one thing to you? You know that speech, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow? The important word in that speech is and." A light went off in my head, and I caught it instantly. I said, yeah, don't say any more. What he was saying was, it is not that tomorrow seems to be so painful. It is the fact that there will be so many of them that will be difficult, and I loved that insight. Control, being able to do a scene 10 times and making each identical in tone, gesture, expression, that's a point of pride. They connect with the characters through imagination, and the performance is external. They can play a king one week and a deck-swabbing pirate the next, no problem. They prize being chameleons.
And I love poetry above all.
Above Lord Wessex. My lord, when you cannot find your wife, you better look for her at the playhouse. Playwrights teach us nothing about love. They make it pretty, they make it comical, or they make it lust. They cannot make it true.
Oh, but they can.
In America, if an actor's technique is brought up, 9 times out of 10 it's brought up because they are using the method. The method is about finding the emotions and using them. You live the part, connect with the part, immerse yourself in that character's world. You use genuine feelings and experiences to generate authentic performances. They'll often work to get physically in that as well, perhaps most famous being Robert De Niro putting on weight for Raging Bull. You're erasing the distinction between the actor and the character. This often involves lots of preparation. Think Heath Ledger shutting up and writing down madness before playing the Joker in The Dark Knight. It can bring out great performances for certain. I can't tell you how many times I've watched Marlon Brando, often considered the finest method actor ever, do his diamond bullet speech in Apocalypse Now.
Like I was shot with a diamond. A diamond bullet right through my forehead. And I thought, my God, the genius of that. The genius. The will to do that.
The result of just letting him sink into the character and create this method in madness. To hear tell in America, the method is the only genuine way of acting. That kind of gets to the nub of the problem. To paint in very broad strokes, the British admire talent, honed to perfection, stiff upper lip, bearing strife with grace, understatement, self-deprecation even. Americans admire hard work, authenticity, finding and exceeding your limits, spit in the eye of the dragon, endurance, grit. Mastery of craft alongside the method is essentially putting two cultures in close proximity that operate somewhat at cross purposes, the internal versus the external. An American actor staying up for days to truly experience exhaustion, or going in the woods and skinning a bear. Actions like these sound appealing to American culture because these are professionals willing to sacrifice and endure for the sake of giving us authenticity. To a British actor, that's excessive, if not actually distasteful. Americans respect someone willing to sweat. The British respect someone so in control they don't sweat. "My dear boy, why don't you try acting?" Laurence Olivier famously said to Dustin Hoffman on Marathon Man. Anthony Hopkins said, "Acting is make-believe," and calls it fantasy. Words that sound so soft to American ears. Not to overplay this, of course, it's not like it's the snobs versus the slobs or something, but Ian McKellen compared the two as being like a photograph versus an oil painting. One demands you see reality, the other sees reality through the eyes of the artist. The Brit is a shapeshifter, the American a Manchurian candidate. The former comes from the theater and needs to deliver the same performance time after time after time. The latter was invented for film, where finding that one perfect performance is what matters. This clash of styles became especially an issue in a mix of talent in a confined space. For one example, Yaphet Kotto laid into Ian Holm for being in his chair, because Parker didn't like Ash, the bearer of unpleasant truth, the symbol of the officers thinking they're better than the workers who have to split a share between them. Poor Balaji Badejo found himself on the receiving end of Kotto's ire because he's killing off all of Parker's friends. So this became an extra stressor. On the other side, the Americans knew how vital it was going to be for Kane's death to really sell the menace. His was the first actual death in the film, the first victim, the monster eating its way out of him. Some worried that he might not be taking the role seriously, and this was an important picture for them, so they approached him. Ian Holm gives his version of the conversation as being this. "Big scene tomorrow, John." "Is it?" "Yes, you know, the thing coming out of your chest scene?" "Oh, yes, of course." "So..." "Yes?" "So, how are you going to play it?" "How do you mean? Got any ideas? Anything you want to run by us?" "No, I don't think so." With a sense of panic. "Are you sure?" "Oh, yes." "Any ideas at all?" I thought... Yes? I thought I'd use... Go on, John, go on. Just use my not inconsiderable imagination. We're with you, John, go on. I'd use my not inconsiderable imagination and just do it. Home ads there were no doubt very disappointed to hear that Hurt wasn't going to swallow an orange whole, lie on the floor, and spend an hour trying to sick it up. As I said, though, these differences are broad strokes. Ridley Scott seemed to prefer authenticity, while Sigourney Weaver, a child of American money, seemed to have a sensibility more in keeping with the British cast and crew. Scott had actual blood and gore used for Kane's scene, wanting things to be real. The smell was awful. Weaver, recognizing the pride of the self-made man in Scott, tweaked his nose by asking if his Rolls-Royce was a gift from his parents. Perhaps a bit of payback, because with Parker being last man standing, he'd be the one to most challenge Ripley. So Scott told Koto, who was probably the most method of them all, to put up a wall there, annoy her so that the tension would come through on the scene. Koto actually liked Weaver, but was dedicated to his craft, and thus was dedicated to getting on Sigourney Weaver's nerves. It was the chestburster scene, though, that was a nerve strike to Koto. Before that, the actors were comfortable with everything, laughing and joking around. Hurt was positioned in the table with a fake chest, a glass of wine in one hand and a cigarette in the other. Stanton was playing the guitar for everyone. With all the cameras set up, the cast assumed that it was like any expensive shot that is hard, if not impossible, to repeat, like blowing something up. The camera was there to capture the effect. No. The effect could be reset and repeated as needed. It might be unpleasant, certainly, but you can redo it until it's exactly what you need. But there would only ever be one first time for the actors to witness what happened, and Scott wanted to capture that. It worked. No one was prepared for what happened. Even Scarrett lurched back in horror at it. Fortunately, he was enough under control that when Koto, being in the moment, improvised picking up a utensil to stab it, to hold him back, not just protecting the valuable puppet, but in keeping with what Captain Dallas had seen the acid blood could do. After that, Koto would return home each night and just not talk to anybody. I've seen people die in the war, but I never saw anything as bizarre as this. It scared me so much that I go around the set in a fright. One of the dangers of the method is the way the line blurs. So rather than thinking how good that was, he, Koto, was viewing the experience through Parker's eyes. An experience that was so horrible, he knew that was going to destroy his career. He'd need to do Shakespeare after this, he thought, to get the proverbial stench off him. But this is sort of what Scott was going for in trying to give the actors an authentic experience. All the jokes about penis monsters, giving birth, and so on, they were gone now. They had always been professional, of course, but now they took the subject itself seriously. Koto used it on Weaver after the alien had taken Dallas. She was now in charge, but Weaver was playing the role weak. Her character is the second officer, now thrust in charge. The experience with the chestburster changed how Koto had planned to approach this part. This is a threat. This must be killed. Seeing Ripley like this, Parker responds, "You gotta be kidding. You're the captain of this ship? I'm 250 pounds, black as can be. I have a fucking following, bitch. So if you're the captain of this ship, you better fucking tell me." The pushing drove Weaver to push back, and it gave her a hardness that the rest of the film needed. She was a little concerned with the improvisation about the nudie magazine that Ash would use to smother her. Unfamiliar with Cockney rhyming slang, she naturally was extremely uncomfortable when Scott came up to her and said that Ash was going to shove it, quote, up your north and south. She learned it was a way of saying mouth, which was more acceptable than what she'd feared he'd meant. Ash then got his beheading in the fight with Parker. The act reminded Koto of a first that he had made in the 1970 film The Liberation of L.B. Jones, when Koto played the first black man to kill a white man on screen. Killing Ash twisted Koto's knobs further, and he knew Parker had to kill the alien. That's what this film had to be. Forget all the other endings. Parker kills it. It got to the point Ridley Scott kept avoiding him because Kodo kept coming up with new ways that Parker was going to kill this thing before it killed him. But what was providing true pressure was Fox's decision to make Alien their 1979 premium picture. This put a lot of pressure on the production to get it done quickly, a year's worth of prep work being completed in 4 months. Oh, and also, you have to make this movie incredible. 1977 was Star Wars, 1978 was the sequel to The Omen, 1979 was to be Alien, and 1980 was to be The Empire Strikes Back. You don't want to be the one to break the chain, Scott. Funny enough, the Buddy Holly story proved to be a much bigger hit for Fox than Damien Omen 2 had been. A producer asked Roger Christian why Scott was so slow. He was shocked. They were doing 30 to 35 setups a day, shooting with 2 cameras. Fast wasn't proving fast enough. And there were thoughts, after all the wooing, that maybe Ridley Scott had been a mistake, that he wasn't ready for production of such scope. Some of the actors were unhappy they weren't getting enough direction from him, but he pointed out he'd given them each a huge biography he'd written personally to shape their character. He trusted them to bring out the performance. The question was whether they could bring in the film itself on time and on budget. The leadership at Fox was becoming less and less sure this was possible.